Now imagine being a mom and your son suddenly has a hemorrhage stroke and leaves
Mm.
him as a quadriplegic in the prime of his life, right, in his 40s. And also he is a father to two young daughters. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Annette Libeskind Berkovits is joining us to talk about her biographical, I can say that, it's Champagne Sundays. I'll get my words here, autobiographical poetry book. It's a memoir. And she uses the Red Sea in there as kind of this dual symbol for fear and also hope, right? Because you think about the ocean and the seas, like that's just insurmountable, but it helps. It really does help. And so it is out there now. Her book is called Erythra Thalassa, Brain Disrupted, and you can get it now. You can go to her website, AnnetteBerkovits.com. That's Berkovits, AnnetteBerkovits.com. We're very excited to have her on the show. She's a scientist, a conservationist, an author, all-around amazing woman, and welcome to the show. Annette, how are you?
I am well. Thank you very much, Nancy and Lisa, for having me. I'm glad to be with you.
Now, am I pronouncing anything correctly? You can say I'm wrong on all of it.
Yes, you're pronouncing everything correctly. I would just emphasize that Erythra Thalassa, which is the first part of the title of my recently released book, is a Greek title, which is the reason why some people stumble on it. And what it means is the Red Sea. And if you give me a moment, I'll explain to your listeners why I chose that as the title. And it has to do with the fact that I'm a biologist. So the minute I saw erythra, I associated with erythrocyte, which is a red blood cell filled with hemoglobin that gives it the blue color, and the Red Sea. So I thought, this is exactly what happens to my son's brain. The Red Sea just spilled in there. But I also liked the name because it evokes the Red Sea, which is the ancient account of Israelites crossing the Red Sea. And that biblical passage connotes an insurmountable obstacle to gaining freedom. And in the case of my son, it was freedom perhaps of a life that's altered, but surviving. So that's why I hung on to the title Erythra Thalassa, even though some people said, oh, well, no one will know what it means, but I still like the sound of it. So Erythra Thalassa means the Red Sea.
I love that you said that, and correct me on that too, because we start saying urethra, and that's not the same thing, everyone. But Erythra Thalassa, I think it's important that we do embrace titles that we don't know, so we start to learn about them and names. It's like I belong to this social media thing, Seek, and it's through National Geographic and the Science Foundations, and where you post photos of wildlife and nature and plants and anything you can see that's natural, and it helps you identify. And here comes all the scientific names, Latin, Greek, all of it. And I have no clue what I'm looking at, but if you start looking a little deeper, you start to realize that it's a pattern. It's almost like math and music put together. There's the way these terms are, and there's a reason why things are named that way. And so I really appreciate that you did it, even though I know every marketing person probably said, don't do that.
Right.
Yeah, no, and it's a challenge for me to learn, so I like that. I love that. And also, when you talk about the Red Sea, you think about, the magnificence of the sea and people going, it's like, it is hope, right? I think it's interesting that you're also in New York. And New York, you've got to think about everyone coming to New York City and the Statue of Liberty and crossing that ocean, even just going on the Mayflower. I know that you've also left Poland and Israel, then coming here when you were younger and a teenager. So those big moves in life are always exciting and scary. And Nancy and I have made a lot of those moves in between Africa and Mexico and all kinds of places. But there's always that mixture. And your blood is pumping in part of it, and your heart is part of that. Your soul is part of it. It's like you are aware 100%.
Absolutely, absolutely. If I may, who am I talking now? Lisa or Nancy? Both of you, actually.
Well, yes.
I want to tell you something that relates to your toast about horses. I know it's not about this poetry book, and I'll get to it in a second, but horses relate to two of my other books. My first book was a memoir of my father's survival through the Nazis and Soviet gulags and communist Poland.
Wow.
But in it, I tell the story of my father, who enlisted in the Polish army before World War II. And I won't explain the reason why, because it's all in the memoir called In the Richest of Places. But the first assignment he had in the military, the commander asked him to take care of his horse. My father had never been near a horse in his life. And he was totally overwhelmed and terrified. So when he went into the stable, he just figured, well, it's a living creature. You have to treat it very gently. And he spoke to it softly in Yiddish. So this might be the first horse that had a Yiddish conversation with a soldier, which is a very funny story. And the second way your horse toast resonated with me was because my second book, Confessions of an Accidental Zoo Curator, because I did in fact become a curator at the Bronx Zoo by accident, kind of. How that happened, you would have to read the book. But the first thing that happened during my job interview is that this esteemed zoologist keeps very weighty zoology texts off his shelf, and I was mortified because it had been a long time since I had studied zoology, and I had no idea what he would ask me. And he opened to a particular page, turned the book toward me, and he said, "What is this animal?" And I said, "It's the Przewalski horse." And he was like, "The job is yours," because he said all these years he could never pronounce the name. And it's named after a general who has a Polish name. So that horse helped me get the job. It's the Mongolian wild horse, which is
cool. Oh, wow,
endangered.
those are beautiful.
But anyway, I
they are endangered, and they're so beautiful. They're really beautiful.
Yeah,
but
they are.
If we're talking about this because it's the year of the horse, and I mean it's the National Horse Day, but I think it's the year of the horse every year, every day, and I think about what they've done around the world, right? Just like you're saying.
Yeah. So I just had to put in my two little horse stories here to complete your toast.
I know, we like that. I know, we all got on Nancy's toast here. Nancy, the communal toast to horses. You know, when we go back to Erythra, now if I said that, now I'm going to get it wrong now. Say it again.
Erythra, yes.
Erythra Thalassa. Now, writing poetry, because you've written, I know you've stories about your family, the history that you've been through with your family, then and also talking about, your life and wildlife conservation, but then now getting into poetry. Does poetry help as a rhythm? I write songs and poetry along with articles. Articles is like, here's this basic thing, but there's this rhythm that, I don't know, I always find it's soothing in a way, and it offers a different challenge that helps.
Yes, I do find poetry soothing, reading poetry. But I have to say, when I retired and I decided to start writing books, which is something I had wanted to do all my life, but having the kind of job I had was just not possible. I did do a lot of writing in my job, but it was writing curricula and science programs for teachers and for students. It wasn't this kind of writing. So I started taking a variety of writing classes, and I decided to take poetry courses, and I fell in love with it, and I realized that poetry doesn't all have to rhyme. Poetry could be sort of a free verse without rhyme, but the beauty of poetry is that you get to say something very complex in a very compact way. So you have to be extremely mindful of your choice of words to convey a lot with fewer words. And I found that challenging and interesting. So poetry has sort of been in my life as a reader for a long time and as a writer for, almost 2 decades now. But the way I came to writing this poetry book is that I didn't really start out writing this book. What I started out was pouring out my grief onto pages as I sat in front of various intensive care units where my son was laying in a coma and operating theaters when he was being operated on. And I just had to get the tension out, and I found that writing it down, writing my feelings, writing what was happening in my heart and in my brain at the moment helped me. And it wasn't until relatively recently that I looked at the bunch of poems that I had written, and I realized that there was an arc, that there was a story, that was almost from beginning to this point of what's happened to him. So I decided to assemble it into a book on the 6th anniversary of his stroke, which was this November.
I think it's something that parents going through this as caregivers, or anyone as caregivers, can really identify with, where, when you're reading a novel or something, or a big, thick book, or a how-to, it's when you're in that medical zone, your brain is all over the place, and you're freaking out, and you're trying to handle not just the fear of what's happening to your loved one, and when there's the whole medical system to navigate, and what caregivers go through is pure hell. And you also have to deal with the emotional thing, that the relationship changes. And I think poetry allows it to be very real. Like it's poetic and beautiful and heartfelt, and then straight up, and you've got a candid edge to you. That's really, I think, we've been through this. Nancy and I have been through a stroke in our family, and we didn't even know if it was a stroke that my step grandfather had. We didn't know, and we were in a foreign country, and it was a mess. And the dynamic of the entire family shifted. It was not positive. It was very difficult, and it really is like music and poetry can help that. And you can't be all flowers and roses, and you can't be full of it when this stuff goes down. You know what I mean? You just have to.
Absolutely. When you're talking about your deepest emotions, it's the most honest thing you can do.
And you are honest, and I appreciate that. Nancy, you're saying something?
No, I was just going to say that negotiating the medical system, no matter what country you're in, we've lived in several different countries, and it is probably one of the most difficult things ever, because emotions are running high, and you're dealing in a clinical space where everybody's trying to be really, really efficient, and they don't want to. There's that thing of, if I listen to how you're feeling, could go on for hours, and it'll actually make you be more emotional than you should be. There's all kinds of thoughts on it, and they really need to get to what they're trying to do to help the patient. The patient usually is not cooperative because they're not getting what's going on a lot of times, especially when dealing with strokes. It is just really a very difficult thing to be able to cope with it and go on with a somewhat normal life. And so I know that anybody who's been through it will understand what I'm saying, and it really helps if you have a circle of people around you who, whether they truly understand or not, can at least pretend to understand. And lend a helping hand in whatever way, but just to even sometimes let you have some space to talk about it.
Yes.
Because I found a lot of people are like, oh no, that's negative. We don't talk about anything negative. And I'm like, well, I don't know how you solve anything then, and I don't know how you get past anything if you can't talk about it. And that's one of the biggest things I found was that when you're trying to help somebody, whether they want help, realizing they need help or not, and you have to deal with them, then you have to deal with your own stuff, then you have to deal with the medical system. It's huge. It's huge.
Well, Nancy, you said something that you almost sort of sight unseen. You were talking about a particular poem that I wrote, which I titled "Give It to Me Straight." It's as if you were talking to the doctor, because when your loved one, in this case your son, your child, is hovering on the brink of life and death, and you just want to know, is he going to live? Is he going to be okay? And the doctor spouts a lot of medical gobbledygook.
Yeah.
And you just want the answer. Just tell me he's going to live. Just don't tell me all this other stuff right now. So I wrote a poem about that, and what you were saying just reminded me of it. But in talking about needing a circle of people to support you when such a tragedy strikes, of course that's true. In my case, things became really hairy because at the same time that my son had the stroke, my husband had a stroke. Talking about lightning striking twice. So he couldn't even accompany me, to sit and cry in front of the intensive care unit. But I had good friends that came, and one of them did something that I would have never thought of. But in retrospect, I think it was one of the most generous things she did. She came to the hospital, and I was sitting there, brokenhearted, and she said, "You know what? I'm going to leave you here because I'm not helping you, and I'm going to go to your house." And what she did, she went to my home, and she did my laundry.
Oh, nice.
And she brought, lunch to my husband who couldn't move. He was incapacitated. He also had he was recovering from knee replacement.
Oh, God.
So that, this all happened at the same time. But there are various things you can do to support people who find themselves in a terrible situation like that.
Yeah.
I want to ask too, Annette, because when you're reading your poetry, you also get into, it's almost like that conversation with God or whoever. Everyone believes, everybody's got their own belief system. But no matter what, you can say you're an atheist, and at the end of the day, when stuff goes down, you're like digging for, like, come on, like, what the hell is this?
Something.
Why?
Yeah.
Why? I've done this. I don't deserve this crap. Like, why do I have to go through this? Why do my loved ones have to go through this? And you have that struggle going on in your poetry where it's like you seek for help and support, and there's that, I don't know, it's like I don't want to say tug of war, but you know what I mean? That whole.
I do. It's a struggle. It's a struggle. Yes. So
for sure.
I say, why pray? And I prayed.
Yeah, exactly.
But the interesting thing on that very subject that I want to mention is that my son, bless his heart, this entire 6 years since this tragedy happened, not once did he ever say, "Why me? Why did this happen?"
That's
to me?
awesome.
Never once. It's just I've been waiting for him to ask. I've been waiting for him to say it. He doesn't. He has inherited my father's positivity and complete optimism. He's got optimism, and I think the optimism is what's keeping him going.
How is he doing now? I mean, because it goes from stroke to quadriplegia, right? So this is isn't like, oh, he's had a stroke and now it gets over it. This is a whole different deal.
This is a whole different animal. Yes. Well, when he lay in a coma a number of times, he fell into a coma several times. He was in the hospital for well over a year, and he had multiple brain procedures.
Wow.
So the doctor said, well, If he comes out of this coma, I could see him walking into my office 3 or 4 months from now, one of the neurosurgeons said. But they didn't know how he would be cognitively. And this only shows how little we know about the brain, what an unknown continent the brain is, because the exact opposite happened. He is unable to move anything, not his legs, not his arms, not his head, nothing. But his brain is in quite good shape. His memory is fantastic. He tells me things that happened 40 years ago that I'd long forgotten. So his short-term memory is not great, but not terrible either. I mean, he may not remember what he had for lunch, but, if you spend your life in bed, that's not something you would focus on. But he has a new aide who is decided to teach him Polish. So I'm a Polish speaker, so when he calls me, he says, "Hello, how are you?" in Polish. So his short-term memory is good enough to learn the language. So that's good enough for me.
That's cool.
Yeah,
Wow.
and he's recently just before he fell sick with COVID, which is another miraculous story that I can tell you. In April in New York, as everybody knows, COVID was at its height. Streets were clogged with refrigerated morgue trucks. And that's exactly when he went in. He went into the hospital on Easter Sunday. And to say I was devastated is an understatement. I honestly did not think that he was going to come out, that we were going to see him. And miraculously, 2 weeks later, a nurse called his wife to say, "We're waiting for an ambulance to send Jeremy back home, but he asked that you order from his favorite Mexican restaurant." And
I'm with him.
Yeah. Cool. So miracles do happen. And I attribute it largely to his incredible will to live and to the optimistic character that he inherited. My parents were Holocaust survivors. He was very close to them. And he always tells me that he sees them. I say, "Where do you see them? In your dreams?" "No," he said, "I see them. They're here. They're telling me to hang on and to hope for new treatments."
Wow. And I think it's you always think about this, like when things are really bad, Holocaust, right? Like, what is the will to survive? What is that kernel that keeps some of us moving forward and some don't?
Yes.
Like there's that thing that you still get up in the morning no matter how bad it is. And then some people, it's like I know right now with COVID, hearing Jeremy's story and your story, I just want to say I'm really glad that you retired at the time you did. Isn't that kind of interesting how that happened,
Yeah.
The dog's agreeing, by the way. Gus is agreeing. Just want you to know. But, I think, looking at COVID right now, we're looking at mental health of people and how they are struggling. A lot of people are struggling. There's economic issues, which creates drama, medical issues, death, and at the same time, youth. We were just recording a show the other day with our friend Bobby DePorter, who's an education expert, and she was saying the call centers for suicide are up 800% for youth, for teens, 30% for adults, but 800% for teens.
This is tragic.
This is that to me is a very big cry for help. How do we instill that kernel of optimism to move forward right now?
Yes, it's. I grant you that it's something indefinable. It's very hard to define what it is that gives people that ability to look at everything in positive light. When I visit my son, he tells me every day before I leave, and it just makes me want to break down crying every time. And I'm not a crier, but he says, "Mom, I'm the luckiest guy on the Upper East Side, except for Dad. And
That's sweet.
you know, in his condition, to utter the word lucky is just beyond me.
You know, the lucky term is weird to me.
It is. It is. You define your own luck. I actually wrote a poem about that. That very thing. You know, what is luck? And luck is the way you define it.
It's difficult because these things are beyond our control as far as can we, you know, there are some things you can prevent, like you can get a vaccination against something and hopefully it'll work and it will prevent that disease from, you know, we have vaccinations and shots for polio and yellow fever and typhoid and all these things that we haven't had to personally, hopefully, you know, deal with. Now we have a pandemic, you know, and people are racing to solve that problem. And there will be a vaccine and it'll work for most, but some not. And it's just, you know, it's like there are medical things like this seem so beyond our control. That I mean,
absolutely. I mean, there he was. My son was a healthy, you know, father of 2 kids. He stayed home to go to a parent-teacher conference. Went to take a shower, and collapsed in the shower. And if it wasn't for that 2 little girls being home, banging on the door saying, "Daddy, come out," because they noticed he wasn't coming out.
Oh, that's scary.
You know, he wouldn't have survived. As is only about 5% of people with that kind of a major brain bleed survive, but they did save his life by calling for help, and they're the ones that are keeping him going. He wants to see them succeed and achieve in school and graduate, and so on.
It's hard for kids too. I lost a very close person to me and a musical partner, a love partner. Who exactly was in the shower. I don't know what's going on with showers, man. I'm going to start taking baths. He got in the shower and he had a blood clot, and that was it. He fell in the shower. Yeah. He died in the shower.
Oh, my
boom.
Goodness. Yes.
And it's still
so
today,
to
like
that.
Nancy and I still can't even, because he was like a son to her, and he's just such a, you know, part of our life, and it's still like I still like have a hard time. We both don't. I don't know. We both think something weird happened. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's hard to grapple with death when you're not there seeing it. You know what I mean? It's hard to kind of understand that he went and it was that quick and he was that young.
Yes.
He was, you know, in his 30s, and for him to die like that, it was a blood clot. And I'm like, he had the flu, got up and went to take a shower, and that was that. And that was Matt, goodbye, you know. So
that's a tragedy. And young people are not prepared with wills, with insurance, young people don't think about these things at all.
No, because it's like, hey, you know, and insurance, and that's the hard thing when you go to help in a hospital situation. It's a corporation. I don't care what anybody tells me. The hospitals are corporations, just like funeral homes are corporations. You know, we just went through that with a friend who had passed, and I couldn't believe the horror of what funeral homes put people through. It blew my mind away. Sorry to everybody in that industry, but good God, it's like Google advertising. You know, it's like,
well, you know, so do hospitals. You know, after all the 20 different brain procedures that my son had and in and out of a coma, when they could no longer really do any more for him, they wanted him out of the hospital. And because, you know, he was 46, he was not on Medicare, they were like, you have to get him out of here. I said, what do you mean get him out? What should he, at the time he was, you know, he was on a breathing tube. He had all this equipment attached to every part of his body, and he couldn't move. I said, well, how can we take him home? And they just, every day, you've got to get him out. You've got to get him out. Well, how are we going to get him out? It's a nightmare.
Well, and in my dad's case, he had a terminal illness, and he lived far longer than what the doctors told us. But there was no preparation for the amount of drugs they gave him, and how his personality changed, and what he became on the drugs they gave him. He was on 19 narcotics. And then at the end, when he finally passed away, years later, the one doctor, his head doctor, looked at the charts, and it just flabbergasted me. And he looked at my mom and I, and he's like, I had no idea he was on this much medication. And we're like, but that's your job. That's what you do. That's what you get paid for. And it just astounded me, the total, he was impersonal and bring on non-caring.
Oh, that's a very sad case. My son was fortunate to fall into the hands of an absolutely remarkable neurosurgeon, Dr. David Langer. And I have to tell you, I'll tell you one thing about Dr. David Langer at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York. And I'll tell you one little story about him, and that will tell you everything you need to know about the kind of doctor he is. It happened to be Mother's Day. I was at the hospital. My son was still in a coma. I was sitting outside in the hospital corridor because I was waiting to go into my son's room. They were working on him, so I couldn't go in. So I was sitting on the bench along with my daughter-in-law. And who do we see coming down the hall? It's the chief of neurosurgery, Dr. David Langer. He comes up to us on Mother's Day and has two giant bouquets of roses, one for my daughter-in-law and one for me. He said it's Mother's Day.
Wow.
And I mean, this man who is worrying about, life and death issues, thought to bring bouquets of flowers to us on Mother's Day. That was absolutely, that tells you everything you want to know about the kind of surgeon he was, the kind of human being he was. And actually, he's featured in a Netflix documentary called Lenox Hill. I encourage people to take a look because he's quite remarkable. So, and he was also instrumental in helping my son get through COVID in April. Because he intervened on his behalf to get the convalescent antibodies. There were very few at that time, and they were restricted only to special research studies. But that's what helped my son survive.
Wow. So what is? I'm glad to hear that. I know that we have some special doctors in our life. Dr. Jackie Ubani is our heart surgeon, not heart surgeon, a heart cardiologist on our shows, and don't mess with her, man. she's like, everyone, you're going to get healthy, and you will not have more than 5 ounces of wine, ladies, at night. She sticks on us, I'm telling you. And I think there are really amazing doctors. I think the system is just broken, needs fixing.
Yes,
and
totally.
Because it's sad because the people working in the industry are caregivers. They are care people. What is life like now for you? Are you writing more? Are you still writing poetry? What's life like for you right now?
Well, what is it like? In between doing my best to help with my son, what I do is I completed a historical novel that is based really on my mother, but it's fictional. I just my protagonist beats my mother's heart, so to speak. It's a persona built around my mother, who was a remarkable woman, and it's called To Swallow the World, and it's with my agent now. Hopefully she will get it to a publisher shortly. And I've begun writing a new novel, a kind of magical realism, because we need more magic in our lives. So I'm working on that, and in between I write poetry. So poetry is sort of a constant. When I take a break from my novel, I write poetry.
I think poetry, I love that you're doing this, and I love that you have a poetry book that's autobiographical. It's like a memoir, a poetry memoir. It's very rare. that we see that now.
Yes.
Think about literature. It was poetic, and it was always poetry infused or a full-on poetry. And I think it's really important. I mean, just look at Shakespeare, and then playwrights use poetry. And it's, to me, it's like it's not a dying art. It's just there's millions of poets in the world, but our society needs to get back into that and put our phones down a little bit. I feel like phones are a great tool, but we've got to kind of stop and be able to sit with a poem. You don't just read a poem and turn the page. You sit with it like a song. You sit with it a little bit, chew on it, think about it. It's like art.
Yes.
It really is.
And I have to say, for your listeners, I hope anybody who picks up this poetry chapbook, you'll see that people have told me, readers have told me that it's accessible poetry. Some poetry books of some poems are very hard to digest, and you kind of have a difficult time getting into what exactly was the poet talking about. I don't think that's the case. I think my poetry is more plain spoken, sort of more like Billy Collins is my poetry hero. He writes poems that are accessible. He was the poetry laureate. I love his poetry, and I try to emulate him as much as I can.
That's exactly why I was saying you're a poetry candidate. Just straight up, you can get right into it immediately, and I really appreciate that you've done that. But before we get to your champagne toast, I know Nancy, you have another thing.
I was just going to say, how do you have you come across the attitude of you're either a science mission, mathematician kind of person, or you're a creative, and you can't be both? Have you?
Yeah, it's funny you ask that because just a couple of weeks ago, and I published an article in the Women's Writers, Women's Books website, which is exactly that. It's titled "Art and Science: Two Sides of the Same Coin."
Oh,
yes.
Cool.
Oh, I want to go.
Awesome. Yes, I agree. I believe that you can be both, and if you're writing it from both perspectives, it's deeper. It's more thorough. It deals with all of the aspects of any issues because every issue has multiple angles.
I think it all started when people started doing the left-hand brain, right-hand brain. You remember? They started that. So it's like all of a sudden your brain got divided, and so you couldn't cross channel.
Hey, listen. Our brain has gray matter for a reason. We have gray matter for a reason.
Yes, let's think with the whole brain instead of just half of it.
Yeah,
yes.
please.
And we still have to learn how to use it more. To me, it's like I don't know. The whole brain is fascinating, and it's obviously very difficult when things happen to it, which you're going through with your son Jeremy. But to me, the brain is fascinating and it's creative, and we tend to always think creativity comes from your heart and soul, but your brain is what gets it out there. You can have the emotion, but how are you going to formulate the emotion to connect with others? That's where your brain is. It's your processing point. Yeah, it's the manufacturer of the emotion. It's a manufacturer. It sends it out there and says, let's package it this way. So it can, that's what it is. It's, Santa Claus is up there making nice presents for people to make them feel something. That's how I look at it. We have our own processing.
Lisa, speaking of presents, I have to mention that my son asked me to help him edit the lyrics for a song that he wrote for his wife and daughters. He started writing it just before he fell sick with COVID. And then I have musicians that I hired to play for him, and they wrote the music for it. So anybody who is interested in seeing a beautiful song of gratitude of a man in my son's condition for his wife and daughters, it's on my website, AnnetteBerkovits.com.
Awesome. That is so awesome. Music heals, man. Music, poetry, writing, all of it. See, that just proves it's the connecting force. I feel like the arts is what's going to get us through everything in the world. And the day we don't have the arts, and that's what's so hard about COVID, it's like musicians, and the performance and everything, we can still connect, thank God for the internet, even though we, get mad at it once in a while. the reality is the arts will pull us through, and the arts always document our history, the true history. So just saying, and the true science.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Oh, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Before you go, what is your champagne toast? What are you happy about?
Okay. My champagne toast is to all the healthcare professionals who are dealing with COVID and doing magnificent work under incredibly difficult circumstances, and to all the families that are suffering because a loved one has fallen ill with COVID. I want to toast them for their resilience and for their spirit. And I'm going to do my toast in the Jewish people have a toast that I think is so appropriate for today and for every day. The word is l'chaim. It means to life.
To life.
L'chaim. L'chaim. That's my toast for today.
Awesome. I love that. Well, l'chaim to you,
Thank you.
To everyone.
You too.
Thank you for joining us. Everyone, again, Annette Libeskind Berkovits. It is Erythra. Now I'm going to get it messed up again. Say it again. The name of the book.
Erythra Thalassa, Brain Disrupted.
Erythra. Okay, so Erythra Thalassa. I like that. Now I'm going to get into that. It's got rhythm to it. Brain Disrupted. It is out now through 10th Planet Press. Go to AnnetteBerkovits.com to learn more, and also Amazon, all those great places that you want to buy books. Your independent bookstores, support them. So thank you so much, Annette. You have a wonderful rest of the winter season, and keep us posted on when your next book comes out.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Lisa. Please stay well and enjoy the holidays.
You too.
You take care. Hugs to your family.
Yes.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.